Mr. Harrison, the man who graded essays with a red pen of death and whose smile had, according to school legend, been surgically removed sometime around the fall of the Roman Empire. The teacher so notoriously cold that new students were warned about him at freshman orientation like a natural disaster. Stay out of his eye line. Don't ask questions after Wednesday. And whatever you do not try to be clever. And there he was, standing in the doorway of room 207, holding a pale blue envelope between his thumb and forefinger like it was a contaminated lab specimen. My envelope, my letter, 3 pages of the most embarrassingly sincere, heart on my sleeve, way too dramatic teenage poetry I had ever produced in my life. Written for the wrong man, delivered to the worst possible one. At that moment, I didn't just wish the floor would open up and swallow me. I wished the entire building would. The whole zip code. I was prepared to sacrifice the entire continental United States if it meant not having to walk through that door. But here's the thing about the worst moments of your life. Sometimes they're not actually the worst thing that ever happened to you. Sometimes they're just the moment everything you thought you understood about the world gets very, very quietly rearranged. This is the story of my most embarrassing mistake, and the most important friendship I have ever had. To understand how I ended up in room 207 with my dignity in pieces, and my handwriting being quoted back to me by the most terrifying educator in the tri-state area, you need to understand the ecosystem of Northwood High School. Every school has its own ecosystem, its own food chain, its own climate, its own mythology. Northwood was no different. We had the standard cast, the athletes, the theater kids, the people who had somehow figured out how to be cool and made it look effortless, and the rest of us, who were doing our absolute best to be invisible while simultaneously desperately wanting to be seen. I was firmly in that last category. My name is Maya Hayes, junior year, 16 years old, 5'4" on a good day, chronically behind on sleep, and possessed of the specific kind of invisibility that comes not from being disliked, but from being simply overlooked. I wasn't the loud one. I wasn't the dramatic one. I sat in the middle of classrooms and handed in work on time and said, "I'm fine," when teachers asked how I was doing. And they believed me because I was fine. I was just also, quietly and persistently, completely unseen. I had one real friend, Sarah Kim, who was fierce and funny and had the unique gift of making every situation feel slightly more manageable just by being present in it. Sarah knew about the letter before I sent it. She was, to be precise, the one who called it the most unhinged plan you've ever had, and then helped me pick the envelope color. That's friendship, honestly. The center of my personal universe that year was Mr. Evans. James Evans, technically, though obviously I would not have been caught dead using his first name out loud. New to Northwood that year, transferred from a school in the city that apparently couldn't afford to keep him. Their loss was absolutely our gain, in my extremely biased 16-year-old opinion. He was the kind of teacher that happens to a school like weather, like a change in climate. Before Mr. Evans, art class was where you went to relax between real subjects. After Mr. Evans, it became the only class I couldn't wait to get to. He didn't look like a teacher, for starters. He looked like someone who had made deliberate life choices and was at peace with all of them. He had paint on his hands on days when we hadn't even been painting yet. He brought his own coffee in a thermos that had a small ceramic bird glued to the lid for reasons he never explained. He listened to music while we worked. Real music, not the sad background playlist other teachers used. And sometimes he'd stop in the middle of a lesson and say, "Wait, listen to this part," and we'd all just listen. He had this way of looking at your work, your totally mediocre, possibly embarrassing work, and finding the thing in it that was worth protecting. He'd crouch down next to your desk and look at your painting with the same serious attention he'd give a piece in a gallery. And then he'd say something like, "This is interesting. You're not painting the apple. You're painting how it feels to almost be ripe. That's something." And you'd look at your apple and you'd think, yes, that's exactly it. How did he know? He made you feel seen. For a girl whose primary mode was invisible, that was nothing short of revolutionary. My crush on Mr. Evans was not, I want to be clear, delusional. I was 16. I knew nothing was going to come of it. It was the kind of crush that exists in the imagination only. A feeling you carry around because it makes the world feel slightly more vivid, not because you actually expect anything from it. It was the emotional equivalent of a houseplant, something to tend to. What it was fuel. I started drawing more. I started reading about art. I started staying after class to ask questions about technique and theory, and he answered them with the same full attention he gave everything. And I would walk home afterward feeling like the volume on the world had been turned up. I wanted him to know that. I wanted to thank him, in a way that didn't sound like a thank you card, for what he'd done to my sense of my own potential. And somewhere between wanting to say thank you and being 16 and having read too much romantic poetry, that impulse became a letter. And then there was the black hole. Mr. Harrison occupied room 207 at the end of the East Corridor like a geological feature, like something that had always been there and would always be there, and which the landscape had simply arranged itself around over time. He taught AP World History. 2 years I had been in his class. For 2 years, the experience could be summarized as precise, rigorous, and deeply uncomfortable. He was tall and lean and wore suits in varying shades of gray and charcoal that managed to look both expensive and deeply mournful at the same time. He didn't yell. That was the thing about him that wrong-footed people. They expected the meanness to be loud. It wasn't. It was quiet. It was a raised eyebrow and a 3-second silence before responding to your answer. It was handing back a paper with a single annotation. Insufficient. Not insufficient argument, not insufficient evidence. Just insufficient. You, as a person, have not met the basic requirements. He moved through the school like a weather system that everyone tracked from a distance. Students rerouted their hallway paths to avoid walking past room 207. The seating chart in his class was treated like assigned seats on a lifeboat. You did not deviate, you did not negotiate, you were simply grateful for the place you had been given. The folklore around him was extensive and creative, in the way that folklore always is about people we don't understand. He slept in a coffin. He had been placed under a curse in a previous life. He subsisted on black coffee and the ground-up dreams of students who tried to argue their grade. My personal theory, which I kept entirely to myself, was simpler than any of those. I thought he was a person who had once been full of something and had, at some point, become empty, and that the emptiness had hardened into this, into the gray suits and the red pen and the terrible, precise silences. I had no evidence for this. It was just a feeling I got sometimes when I watched him look out the window during a lecture, like he was somewhere else, like something far away had his attention, and the classroom was just where his body happened to be. The closest thing I had to a positive interaction with Mr. Harrison in 2 years was the day he handed back an essay on the fall of Constantinople with a B- and the single annotation, adequate. I kept that paper. Adequate, from Mr. Harrison, was the academic equivalent of a standing ovation. So that was my world, the sun, the black hole, and me, somewhere in between, with a letter I'd spent a week writing and an extremely questionable delivery plan. I want to tell you about the letter before I tell you what happened to it, because the letter matters. Not because it was good. It was not good, in the literary sense. It was extravagant and overwrought, and used the word luminous in a way that no one with a functioning editorial instinct would have allowed. But it was honest. It was the most completely honest thing I had ever written. I spent a week on it. An actual week. I went through 11 drafts. I filled half a notebook with versions that were either too restrained, reading more like a performance review than a confession, or too unhinged pages of pure feeling with no discernible structure that I couldn't bear to reread. The final version was 3 pages, written by hand on good paper with a fountain pen I'd bought specifically for the occasion, which tells you everything you need to know about the mental state I was in. I wrote about what it felt like to be invisible, and then, suddenly, to have someone see you. I wrote about how he'd looked at my painting of a fruit bowl and found something real in it, and how that had felt like being told a truth about yourself you'd been waiting to hear. I wrote that his classroom was the only place in the building where I felt like the right version of myself. I wrote that his smile could probably power a small city, and I want to retroactively apologize to myself for that sentence. But at the time, it felt entirely justified. I wrote near the end the line that would come back to haunt me in the most unexpected way. I would rather break my own heart than never let you know it beats for you. I sealed it in a pale blue envelope, Sarah's choice. She said it was literary, and wrote his name on the front, Mr. Evans. The plan was simple. Slip it into his faculty mailbox on Friday afternoon, let him find it over the weekend, and return to school on Monday, having done the bravest thing I'd ever done, whatever happened next. The plan did not survive contact with Friday afternoon. The final bell rang, and I felt like I'd been injected with pure adrenaline. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I waited for the hallway to clear, clutching my backpack straps like they were the last stable thing in the world, and then I walked to the main office. The route to the faculty mailboxes was, in theory, a 30-second walk. In practice, it was the longest journey of my life. I was convinced that every person I passed could see through my backpack to the envelope inside. I was convinced my face was doing something physically alarming. I walked slightly faster than normal and slightly slower than a run, and probably looked exactly like someone doing something inadvisable. The main office was almost empty. Mrs. Gable, the school secretary, was on the phone and didn't look up. The mailboxes were right there, a wall of labeled slots in alphabetical order. E. Right there. Easy. I could do this. And then I heard a voice behind me. Sharp, quiet, completely unmistakable. Miss Hayes. I turned into stone. Mr. Harrison was standing by the office door, holding a folder, watching me with the expression of a man who had interrupted something and was deciding whether it was worth caring about. His gray eyes were unreadable in the way that his gray eyes were always unreadable, which was to say, entirely. "What are you doing in here?" "I needed a form," I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from a much smaller, more frightened person than me. "What form?" Absolute blank. My brain had evacuated. Late bus pass. He looked at me for a moment with the expression he reserved for students who had clearly not done the reading. "Bus passes are on the counter. Get one and leave." He turned and walked toward the mailboxes. This is the moment I have replayed more times than I can count. The moment where, if I had simply waited 10 more seconds, if I had simply not panicked, the entire following year of my life would have been different. But I didn't wait. I watched him approach the mailboxes, and I felt the letter burning in my backpack like a hot coal, and I thought, now. It has to be now. Before he blocks the view. Before I lose my nerve. I yanked the envelope from my bag. I lunged toward the wall. I shoved it into a slot. I did not look at the label. The soft crinkle of the envelope dropping into the box was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard, followed immediately by the most nauseating wave of relief. I grabbed a bus pass from the counter. I walked out. I didn't run, which I consider a personal triumph. Outside, I stood in the cold afternoon air and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for a week. It was done. The weekend passed in the specific agony of someone waiting for a verdict. I oscillated between convinced it would go well and convinced I had ruined everything approximately every 40 minutes. Sarah texted me a string of increasingly dramatic check-in messages that ranged from, "You're so brave," to, "What if he's weird about it?" to, "Okay, but what if he's not weird and he actually likes you back?" I could not sleep Sunday night, but none of the scenarios I tortured myself with, not a single one, included the version of Monday morning that was actually waiting for me. First period. Ms. Albright's English class. I was trying to concentrate on a passage about symbolism in The Great Gatsby when the door opened and a student aide stepped in with a pink slip. Ms. Albright read it. looked up. Maya. Just my name, in that particular tone, the tone that says, something has happened. Mr. Harrison needs to see you. The classroom went very quiet. I heard Sarah make a small sound beside me that was either sympathy or suppressed horror, possibly both. 27 pairs of eyes turned toward me with the particular expression that teenagers reserve for witnessing a peer being summoned by the most feared teacher in the building. It was a mixture of relief that it wasn't them and genuine concern that it was me. I replayed Friday afternoon on the walk to room 207, the office, the mailboxes, the lunge, the slot. E. I had aimed for E. Except he had been standing right there, right next to the mailboxes, and the H slot and the E slot were adjacent, and I hadn't looked. I had just shoved it in, and... oh no. Oh, absolutely not. Oh, this cannot be what is happening. I stood outside room 207 for what felt like 3 business days before I raised my hand and knocked. The door opened, and there he was, holding my envelope. My pale blue fountain pen addressed, 3 pages of 16-year-old sincerity envelope, between his thumb and forefinger, like a contaminated lab sample. He didn't say anything. He just held it up. I considered, genuinely and seriously, simply turning around and starting a new life somewhere else. He didn't expose me. That was what I had expected. A public reading, perhaps. Or at minimum, a cold, precise dissection of my poor life choices in front of witnesses. I had mentally prepared a version of myself that could survive public humiliation. I had not prepared for what actually happened. He gestured for me to come in. The class was there. 23 students turning to look at me with the wide, fascinated eyes of people who had just seen someone enter the lion's den. I walked to the empty desk at the front, the one that might as well have had a spotlight on it, and I sat down. He placed the envelope face down on his lectern, and then he continued his lecture. On the steam engine, 25 minutes. I sat at the front of that class for 25 minutes while he lectured on industrialization, the mechanization of labor, and the psychological effects of factory work on the individual soul. I stared at the desk. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Every sentence felt personal. Workers were stripped of individual identity and became components of a larger system. Yes, I understand. The factory demanded uniformity and punished deviation. Relatable. The psychological cost of suppressing individual feeling in service of institutional efficiency was, by any measure, profound. I don't know if he was doing that on purpose. I will never know. When the bell rang, the other students scrambled for the door with the speed of people who had just been given a reprieve. I tried to blend into the crowd. I was almost at the door when his voice cut through the noise. Miss Hayes, stay. The door clicked shut. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock. He stood behind his desk, holding my envelope, looking at it with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not cold, exactly. Not disdainful. Something more like... careful. The expression of a person handling something they have already decided deserves care. He held the letter out to me. I believe this took a wrong turn. My hand was trembling when I reached for it. For a fraction of a second, his fingers and mine were both on the envelope, and his skin was cool and dry and entirely steady. "I'm so sorry, sir," I whispered. "It wasn't for you. It was a mistake. I didn't mean... I was trying to..." "I know who it was for," he said. Not unkindly, precisely, but with a certainty that stopped my rambling cold. A pause. The description of the smile that could power a small city was, as you might imagine, fairly diagnostic. Oh no. He had read all of it, all 3 pages. Of course he had. The heat in my face was extraordinary. I was fairly certain I had achieved a new personal record for sustained blushing. But something in his voice, the very slight, entirely controlled dryness of it, like a man making a very small joke at a funeral, was almost kind, not warm, not reassuring, just not unkind. He set the envelope down on the desk between us. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "I am not keeping this because it was misdelivered to me. I am keeping it because it is the first honest piece of writing I have encountered in this building in a very long time." My brain stopped. I genuinely looked around to check there was no one else in the room he might be speaking to. "It is naive," he continued, his eyes still on the envelope. "It is reckless. Your use of extended metaphor is enthusiastic." A pause. I braced. "But it is unguarded in a way that most adults spend their entire lives learning to perform and never quite achieve." He looked up at me, and I saw it for the first time. That flicker. The thing behind the gray eyes that wasn't emptiness at all, but something that had been covered over, very carefully, for a very long time. Something that looked from a distance a lot like grief. "You wrote," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, became quieter, "that you would rather break your own heart than never let him know it beats for you." He stopped, as if the sentence had weight. "Don't apologize for that," he said. "Don't ever apologize for that." Then he looked back out the window, and the moment closed as quickly as it had opened. "However, next time, check the label." He dismissed me. I walked out of room 207 in a state I can only describe as fundamentally disoriented, like someone had reached into my mental model of the universe and quietly moved something 3 inches to the left. I had walked in there expecting devastation. I had walked out having been seen, not by the person I'd written the letter for, by the one person in the building I'd been most afraid of. The thing about Mr. Harrison's reaction was that it didn't make sense within the model I had built of him. I'm a person who builds models. I observe, I catalog, I construct a working theory of how things operate, and I use that theory to navigate. It's a useful skill, mostly. The problem is that when reality contradicts the model, you have 2 choices: ignore the contradiction or rebuild the model from scratch. Mr. Harrison had just contradicted the model. He had called my letter honest. He had quoted it back to me, gently. He had looked at me with something in his eyes that I recognized, in the way you recognize a piece of music you've heard before, in a different key, as something real. I couldn't unsee it. In class, nothing was overtly different. He was still precise, still demanding, still capable of reducing a poorly constructed argument to rubble with a single question. But there were moments, small, easy to miss, when his eyes would find mine across the classroom and hold for a beat, and I would see it again. That flicker, that guarded, almost involuntary acknowledgement of something we had both been present for. I started paying closer attention. I had always been good at noticing things. Being invisible teaches you that. When no one is watching you, you develop the habit of watching everyone else. And what I noticed, once I started looking properly, was this. Mr. Harrison was not empty. He was contained. There is a difference, and it matters. He kept a single item on his desk that never moved. A small ceramic cup, clearly handmade, slightly irregular in shape, glazed in a deep blue-green that shifted color depending on the light. No pencils in it. No pens. Just there. On the corner of his desk, every day. He had a book of poetry on his shelf. I could read the spine from the 3rd row. Pablo Neruda, 20 love poems, and a song of despair. That was clearly not a classroom text and had clearly been read many times. And sometimes, in the last 5 minutes of class, when students were packing up and the noise level rose and his attention nominally relaxed, he would look out the window at the parking lot with an expression that was nothing like the cold authority he wore everywhere else. It was the expression of someone standing at a window looking for a person who isn't there anymore. About 2 weeks after the letter incident, he asked me to stay after class again. My stomach did a complicated thing that was somewhere between dread and curiosity, which was, I realized, a genuinely new combination for me in relation to room 207. When the last student filed out, he did something I had never once seen him do. He perched on the edge of his desk instead of standing behind it. It was a small thing. inches of physical informality, but from him in that room, it felt seismic. He looked tired, not the irritable, impatient tiredness I'd associated with him before, just tired. Like a person at the end of a long day that had been going on for years. "Miss Hayes," he said, "the line in your letter about the heart." I opened my mouth to preemptively apologize again. Old instinct. "No," he said before I could. "Don't. I told you not to apologize for that. I meant it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the after-school bustle was starting up. Voices, lockers, the distant thud of the gym doors. "It reminded me of something," he said. "Someone. From a long time ago." And then, slowly, like a man opening a door he had kept locked for a very long time and was no longer certain he remembered how, he told me about Elena. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She had been a poet, an actual poet published, with readers who sought out her work specifically, not just people who stumbled across it. She had a collection about migration and memory that he'd read before he ever met her, which meant he fell in love with her voice before he fell in love with her, which he said was both the best and worst possible order for things to happen in. They met in a university library during their final year, him in history, her in literature, arguing over the same primary source text, both of them certain the other had gotten it entirely wrong. The argument lasted 2 hours and ended with them getting coffee, and then getting more coffee, and then agreeing to continue the argument the following day, which they did, and continued doing for the next 6 years. He paused, and in that pause I could hear him selecting words with the care of someone who has been choosing them for years and still finds them inadequate. She was the kind of person who makes the air around her feel more awake, like everything is slightly more itself when she's in the room. He told me she died. He said it plainly, without softening it, in the way that people speak of things they have said so many times in their own heads, that the sharpness has worn to something duller, but no less heavy. She had gotten sick, an aggressive, rapid illness, the kind that announces itself loudly and moves fast. She was 31. They had been married for 4 years. In her final weeks, when speaking became too difficult, she wrote, "He got up from the edge of the desk. He went to the locked filing cabinet in the corner, the one I had always assumed contained exam papers, and he used a small brass key on his keychain and opened it. Inside, behind a row of student files, was a leather journal, dark brown, worn smooth at the corners. He brought it back to the desk. He held it the way you hold things that are irreplaceable. She wrote me a letter in this," he said, "the last one." He opened it to a page near the back and read a single line. His voice was very quiet and slightly uneven, in the way of a person who has rehearsed something many times and still finds it difficult. "My dearest Alistair, do not let your heart become a history textbook, full of dates of battles lost. Let it break, but do not let it close." He closed the journal. The click was the loudest sound in the room. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Outside, a bird was doing something ordinary and oblivious in the parking lot. The clock ticked. I thought about how some people carry their grief quietly and privately for so long that they stop being visible as grieving people. They just become the hard, reduced version of themselves that grief made. The history teacher who grades with a red pen, the man in the gray suits, the black hole at the end of the East Corridor. And I thought, he's been carrying this for 20 years. Every single day in that classroom, every student who whispered about him in the hallways, every piece of school folklore, the coffin, the curse, the man who was mean for no reason, all of it just over the top of this, like a layer of frost over something that was still underneath, completely alive. "Alistair," I said, and then immediately, "Sorry, Mr. Harrison." He made a small gesture. Not permission exactly, just an acknowledgement that I had heard it, that it was real. "Your letter," he said after a moment. "When I read that line about the heart, I hadn't heard anything like it in... He stopped. She wrote like that. That same recklessness, that refusal to be careful with feeling. He looked at me. I don't know if this was accidental, he said. The letter. I suspect it was. But I want you to know that it did something. That it was not wasted. I didn't know what to say. I was 16, and my most embarrassing moment had just become someone's echo of a 20-year-old grief. And I didn't have language for that yet. So I just said, I'm glad. And I meant it. What happened next was not dramatic. That's important to say because this is the part of the story where, in a different version, something sweeping would happen. A transformation, a montage. Music would swell and Mr. Harrison would start wearing color and laughing in class, and everyone would see that he'd been changed. Real life doesn't work like that. What happened was smaller and slower and, I've come to think, much more true. We started talking. Not regularly at first. It was occasional and slightly awkward in the way that any relationship is when it's trying to find its shape. He'd sometimes ask me to stay after class, or I'd linger at the door with a question about the reading that was technically about the reading, but was also, both of us understood, something else. He told me about Elena in pieces, never as a sustained narrative, more like the way you'd share something precious that you were still deciding how much of to show. He told me about her terrible singing voice and her absolute commitment to singing anyway, in the car, at volume, in ways that made the specific song she was mangling unrecognizable until the chorus. He told me she made her own pasta and insisted it was the same as buying it, which it absolutely was not. He told me she left books open face down, spine cracking them, which he had argued with her about every single time, and would give anything to argue with her about again. And these were not the stories of a great love in the abstract. They were specific and ordinary, and completely irreplaceable in the way that only specific, ordinary things can be. The great tragedy of losing someone is not just the absence of the big things, it's the absence of the particular way they cracked a book spine. In return, I talked to him about things I hadn't said out loud to anyone, including Sarah. About feeling invisible. Not in a self-pitying way. I was fairly clear-eyed about it, which I think was part of what Mr. Harrison responded to. It wasn't, nobody loves me. It was, I exist in this building for 3 years, and I wonder sometimes if I'll leave without having been noticed at all. Is that enough? Is it okay? Or does that mean something is wrong? He listened the way he did everything, completely, without interrupting, without rushing toward a conclusion. Then he said, You were noticed by a teacher 2 doors down, who apparently found your capacity for emotional risk-taking compelling, and by the teacher you accidentally gave your letter to, for reasons that turned out to have nothing to do with the letter. He paused. You were always visible, Miss Hayes. You were simply looking for proof from people who were not yet paying attention. He started giving me books, not assigning them, just leaving them on the corner of my desk at the start of class with a post-it note that said something like, if you're interested, in a way that made it perfectly clear these were not optional in any practical sense. Elena's poetry collection first, with specific pages marked. Then other poets, Mary Oliver, C.K. Williams, Wisława Szymborska. Then a biography of a painter he thought I'd find useful, though he never explained why, and I did, and he was right. He had a way of knowing what you needed to read before you knew you needed it. I asked him once how he did that. He said, You read enough. You start to recognize what a person is missing, the same way a doctor can tell from certain symptoms what the body needs. What am I missing? He was quiet for a moment. Permission, he said. You're a person waiting for someone to tell you your feelings are valid before you act on them. The books are telling you. They already are. In the meantime, something unexpected happened with Mr. Evans. He found out about the letter. Not from Mr. Harrison. To my knowledge, Mr. Harrison never said a word to anyone, and I believe that with complete certainty, because discretion was as fundamental to him as the gray suits. He found out from a student who had been in the office on the Friday afternoon in question, and had apparently, seen enough to construct a working theory. Mr. Evans caught me after class in the second month of the school year. He was kind about it. Genuinely, warmly kind in the way that was entirely characteristic of him. He said he was flattered and touched, and that my writing was beautiful, and that he hoped I knew how talented I was. Everything I had imagined him saying, and I stood there and listened to it and felt almost nothing. Not nothing, nothing. It was still nice. He was still warm, still kind, still the person with the paint-stained hands and the bird on his thermos. But the feeling I'd been tending, that houseplant of a crush, that thing I'd been watering for months, had quietly, without my fully noticing, stopped needing water. I thought about it on the walk home that day. What I had wanted from Mr. Evans was the feeling of being seen, and I had gotten that from someone else, unexpectedly, in a way I couldn't have planned and hadn't chosen. The letter had not reached the person it was addressed to, but the need behind it had found its answer anyway. That was the first genuinely complicated thing I understood that year. That what we want is often not the same as what we need, and that we frequently cannot tell the difference until we have, accidentally, gotten the one we needed. March. 7 months since the letter. Winter into spring. The specific transition where the light changes quality before the temperature does, and everything looks slightly more possible than it did in February. I'd been given a writing assignment in English class. Personal essay, open topic, minimum 1,000 words. Ms. Albright called it a portrait of a person, a place, or a feeling, and said we should write about something real. I wrote about Mr. Harrison, not about the letter, not about the specific conversations. I was careful, and I changed details, because those things were not mine to share. I wrote about the experience of encountering someone who appeared to be one thing and was entirely another. About the difference between emptiness and containment. About what it looks like to carry grief with such consistency and dignity that people mistake it for coldness. I gave Ms. Albright the essay. She gave it back the following week with a handwritten note at the top that said, "This is the best thing you've written all year, possibly ever. What happened?" I showed it to him. I don't know why I made that decision. It felt right in the way that decisions sometimes do when you've stopped overthinking and started trusting. I slid it onto his desk on a Friday afternoon and said, "You don't have to read this, but it's for you." And I left before he could respond. The following Monday, he handed it back. No grade, it wasn't his to grade. But in the margin, in his precise red handwriting, he had written, "You write the way she did. Not the same voice, but the same refusal to look away." And underneath that, "Elena would have liked you." I held that piece of paper for a long time. There is something profound about being compared to someone you never met, by someone who loved them. It is not a compliment exactly, or not only a compliment. It is a form of trust. It is a person saying, "The thing I most loved is not entirely gone, because I can see an echo of it in you." I wasn't a replacement for Elena. I never was, and he never treated me as one. But I was, I think, a reminder that the qualities he had loved in her, the recklessness, the refusal to be careful with feeling, existed in the world, were not specific to her, would not die with her. 2 weeks later, he showed me the journal, not just the line he'd read before, the whole thing. He brought it to our after-school conversation and set it on the desk between us and said, "I think you should read some of this, if you want to." I read for 40 minutes while he sat at his desk and graded papers, occasionally glancing over with the expression of a person watching something they'd decided to trust. Elena wrote with the specificity of someone who understood that the large things are only accessible through the small ones. She wrote about the smell of the library where she and Alistair had argued over that primary source. She wrote about a specific afternoon light in their apartment that she had been trying to describe in a poem for 2 years, and finally, in the journal, managed to get right. She wrote about her diagnosis and her fear, and alongside that, her absolute insistence on not becoming the illness. She wrote, "The doctors keep asking me how I'm feeling, And I want to tell them that feeling is precisely what I intend to keep doing, for as long as I have left to do it. Thank you very much. And near the end, a page that was clearly written on a difficult day, she had written, I'm afraid he will stop. After. I am afraid he will pack all of this up, the feeling, the recklessness, the color, and put it somewhere very safe and never take it out again. I need him to know that the safest thing he can do with it is keep using it. That is the only thing I am asking. I closed the journal. He was watching me. She knew, I said. Yes. And you did it anyway. You packed it up. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the parking lot was emptying. A crow landed on a car roof, looked around, departed. Yes, he said finally. I did. A pause. I think, he said very carefully, that a 16-year-old's misaddressed love letter may have had an unreasonable amount of influence on that particular arrangement. It took me a moment. Then I laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of me. And Mr. Harrison, Alistair Harrison, the black hole at the end of the East Corridor, the man with the red pen of death and the 3 gray suits and the reputation for having his warmth surgically removed, smiled, a real one. Small and slightly rusty from disuse, but real. It looked, I thought, a little like the picture in his wallet, the younger man with his arm around a laughing woman, the version of him that had been there all along. By June, things were different in ways that were hard to point to directly, but impossible to miss if you knew what to look for. Mr. Harrison still wore gray suits. He still graded with a red pen. He still had the capacity to reduce a poorly constructed argument to its component failures in under 60 seconds. But the light in his classroom was different. Or maybe the light was the same, and he was different, and I just noticed it in the light. He started reading aloud at the beginning of class. Just a few lines, not always historically connected to the lesson. Sometimes a poem, sometimes a passage from a memoir. The first time he did it, the class went absolutely still, unsure what was happening. By the 3rd or 4th time, they just listened. It became a thing. People started looking forward to it. He started very occasionally telling stories about the historical figures he taught in a way that acknowledged their emotional lives alongside their political ones. Not sentimentally. He was constitutionally incapable of sentiment in the traditional sense, but with the kind of matter-of-fact recognition that emotions are historical forces, that grief and love and rage shape events as much as strategy and geography do. And the students who had been terrified of him began to be curious about him instead. These are different things. Curiosity is an opening. Fear is a wall. Sarah, who had been following this whole situation from the outside, like someone watching a nature documentary she was not sure would have a satisfying conclusion, said to me in April, "Something has happened to Mr. Harrison." "What do you mean?" He asked Tyler what he thought about something in class today, like actually asked, and waited for the answer. I didn't say anything, but I was smiling. "Maya." "What?" "What did you do?" I shrugged in what I hoped was a convincing way. "I accidentally sent him a love letter." She stared at me for a long moment. I genuinely cannot tell if that's a joke. The last real conversation I had with him that year was the week before finals. He asked me what I was planning to do after school. Not vaguely, specifically. He wanted to know what my plan was. I told him I wanted to study art. Fine art, maybe. Or design. I wasn't certain yet. He nodded, unsurprised. "You'll need to build a portfolio. Have you started?" "Sort of." "Start properly. The sort of version is just the draft." A pause. "You have something genuine," he said. "As a writer, as a thinker. You see things and you refuse to look away from what you see, which sounds simple and is not. Don't let anyone teach you to look away." He picked up his pen. "That's all." I was at the door when he said, without looking up, "Miss Hayes?" "Yes?" "Thank you for the essay." I walked out into the end-of-year corridor, lockers being cleaned out, the particular smell of a school year that's finishing. And I stood there for a moment and thought about what had happened since September. I had tried to send a love letter and failed. I had accidentally found a friendship I didn't know I needed. I had been given an education that had nothing to do with AP World History and everything to do with the question of how to live. And I had somehow, in the mess of all of it, started to become the version of myself I had been trying to describe in a letter addressed to someone else. I'm older now than I was in that story. Old enough to have some distance on it, which is to say, old enough to see the shape of it. So let me tell you what I actually took from that year, because I think the lessons are worth naming, and not in the vague, inspirational poster way. In the specific, honest way that Mr. Harrison taught me to approach everything. The first thing I learned is this: the people who are the hardest to reach are often the people who most need someone to keep trying, not in a savior way, not the naive idea that you can fix someone with enough warmth and persistence. That's not what happened with Mr. Harrison. I didn't fix him. I don't believe he was broken, exactly. What happened was simpler. I accidentally showed him something real, and he responded to it, because real things always find each other eventually if you give them enough time. The people wearing the most armor are not necessarily the least feeling. Often they're the most. They've just learned that feeling without protection is dangerous, because at some point, for them, it was. The second thing, honesty is not a weakness, even when it embarrasses you, especially when it embarrasses you. I spent a week writing that letter and then the better part of a month dying of shame over the fact that the wrong person read it. But the honest thing in the letter, the real, unguarded thing, was what made it matter. Not the recipient, the quality of the feeling, the willingness to say, this is real, and I'm saying it out loud, and I know that's risky, and I'm doing it anyway. Elena had written, "Do not let your heart become a history textbook, full of dates of battles lost." I think about that a lot, about all the ways we let ourselves become historical about our own feelings, cataloging and analyzing and dating the losses, instead of remaining present for the thing that's still happening. The antidote to that is not to stop being hurt, it's to keep being honest, even after you've been hurt, especially then. The third thing, and maybe the most important, what you need and what you want are not always the same address. I wanted Mr. Evans to see me. What I needed was to develop the habit of seeing myself. I thought I was writing a love letter. I was actually writing a manifesto, a declaration that I existed and felt things and was willing to put that in writing and sign my name to it. The letter didn't reach its intended destination, but I did. Eventually. That's the part that mattered. The fourth thing, grief does not make people worse. It makes people different, and different is not the same as lesser. Mr. Harrison in the gray suits, with the red pen and the terrible reputation, was not a diminished version of the person he'd been before Elena. He was a person who had taken an enormous loss and encased it in structure and precision, because those were the tools he had. Not ideal tools, maybe, but not nothing. He had kept going. He had kept teaching. He had kept Elena's journal in a locked cabinet and read her words when he needed to, and carried her ring on the same chain as his house keys, which I noticed once and never mentioned. He was not broken. He was waiting for something he didn't know he was waiting for. And the last thing. The thing I come back to most. Pay attention to the people nobody is paying attention to. Not as a project, not as charity, just as a basic practice of being a person in the world. The student who is always quiet, the teacher everyone is afraid of, the person doing their job in a room at the end of the hall, year after year, in gray suits, with a red pen, carrying something enormous and carrying it alone. You never know what you'll find when you actually look. You never know what they'll find in you. I heard from him a few years later. A card sent to my parents' house, forwarded to my university address. His handwriting on the envelope, precise and unmistakable. Inside was a short note and a printed photograph. The note said, "I thought you should know. I am teaching a creative writing elective. It is, as you predicted, completely terrifying. The students appear to be surviving. So am I. The photograph was of his classroom, different from the one I remembered. There were things on the walls now, student work, poems, a reproduction of a painting I recognized from one of the books he'd given me. The ceramic cup was still on the corner of his desk, but there were other things now too. A plant in a blue-green pot, a string of photographs along the top of the whiteboard. You couldn't see his face. He was standing with his back to the camera, pointing at something on the board. But I could see very clearly that he was wearing a dark green jacket, not gray. I put the photograph on my own desk, where it has been ever since. Not because it's a story about how one person changed another. It isn't, really. It's a story about what happens when two people, each carrying something they didn't know how to put down, accidentally found each other in a school office on a Friday afternoon because a girl with shaking hands couldn't be bothered to check a label. It's a story about a letter that went to the wrong address and arrived, improbably, exactly where it was supposed to. It's a story about being seen, about seeing, about how those two things, when they happen simultaneously and unexpectedly, can change the shape of a life. My letter never reached the person I wrote it for, but I have come to believe that it reached the person who needed it most. And maybe that's always been the point of saying true things out loud. Not to reach the person you aimed for, but to reach the person who was listening. That's the story of my most embarrassing mistake and the best friendship I never planned. It's wild how life does that sometimes. Takes the thing you were most certain was a disaster and turns it inside out and shows you what was actually there all along. I want to ask you something before you go. Is there someone in your life who seems impenetrable, closed off? Someone you've written off as cold or difficult or not worth the effort? I'm not saying go send them a love letter. Please learn from my example on that one. But I am asking, have you looked? Really looked? Not at the armor, but at what the armor might be protecting. If this story meant something to you, like it to let me know, subscribe to hear more, and leave a comment below about a time a mistake turned into something you couldn't have planned. I read every single one, and I promise you, the real ones are always the best ones. See you next time. Ciao.